Hi, my name is Lawrence Price, and welcome to this sermon that I would like to call Enter His Rest. It comes from Hebrews chapter 3, verses 8 through 19, and I'll be reading from the King James. It says, "Harden not your hearts as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years. Wherefore I was grieved with that generation and said, they do alway err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. While it is said today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. For some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. And so again, I want to just call this enter his rest. It's unclear exactly who is the writer in Hebrews. This writer at the beginning of the epistle does not make an introduction, does not leave a salutation, and their writing style really doesn't fit the other writing styles of the other epistles that we know about in the New Testament. However, we do know that this writer is communicating with a group of Christians suffering from persecution, the people that were suffering under the rule of the Roman Emperor Nero. And they were suffering just before the toppling of Jerusalem, and also prior to the Jewish diaspora in AD 70. So these were people that were going through some really significant storms and trials. And basically, throughout this entire letter, the writer in Hebrew uses their deep knowledge of the Old Testament and Jewish rituals to argue that the people should hold on to their faith in spite of the persecution. And in this particular passage, the writer describes entering into God's rest. We have to acknowledge that this writer mentions that this is God's rest and not the people's rest or their rest, that we are a people seeking God's rest, a rest that comes as a result of God's work and not our own work. So allow me just to provide like a brief illustration to kind of drive home this point about what God's rest is. So the first part of Genesis, when we're talking about, describes the creation story. And as many of you probably know, in the first part of that, that's really the first time that we're introduced to the concept of rest in the scripture. So as it lays out, the creation story covers 6 days, and the Bible says that on the end of the 6th day he created man, and then on the 7th day God rested. And so if we rush by that, we'll think of the model that we've all kind of grown up to believe, is that you work first and then you rest. That is what God experienced, but that was not what man experienced. So what happened here is that God created creation, and at the end of the 6th day, he created man. And then on the seventh day of creation was actually man's first day. And so what happened on man's first day of existing is that he entered into God's rest. And so the idea of entering into God's rest is something that we are supposed to start our journey with. It is not something that comes at the conclusion of our journey. So, one of the first points that I really want to make concerning this passage in Hebrews is that just like the illustration I used from Genesis 1, the writer in Hebrew uses the example of the children of Israel going to the promised land the first time, and before they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, as an example of entering into this rest. So basically, when you think about the children of Israel in the Old Testament, the promised land was the embodiment. It was the living example of what it meant for them to enter into God's rest. And so when they got to the edge of the promised land and they sent out the 12 spies, 2 of which came back and said we should enter in, the other 10 said no, and then the nation as a whole didn't go. They ended up being punished for one and had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation died without going into the promised land. And so for the Hebrews that are reading this letter, these people that are going through this intense persecution, no doubt they had a temptation. They were tempted to want to step away from their faith. And this would have been an open idea that they openly discussed and was openly considering because of all the suffering that they were going through as a people under Nero's tyranny. But in this letter, their potential action is being compared to turning away at the promised land. The key to entering into God's rest is what the writer is laying out to them is holding on to your faith. You might be able to sing like an angel. You might be able to preach like Paul. You might wear the nicest clothes and have the perfect smile. You might be the newest Christian in your community. You might be the one with the most experience in your community. But there's only one qualification for entering into God's rest, and there are no other substitutes. There are no substitutes for it. You have to enter in only by faith, and that's the only way to get to it. The next part I want to talk to you about that this writer brings up is that the writer equates an unbelieving heart to an evil heart. And so all of us believe typically in something. There's something that we believe in. We believe maybe in ourselves, or maybe in our point of view, our rationale, or the rightness of our feelings about any particular topic. You just take your pick. That is not the belief that the writer is talking about throughout this passage. The writer instead is establishing a case for belief in the opposite direction, not in what we believe in or what we believe about ourselves in our own capacity. Our belief instead should be in God and His Word. So, how many times have we consulted our own mind instead of seeking the mind of God? Oftentimes have we exercised our own will as opposed to exercising and seeking God's will? The state of that kind of heart in the context of the writer here is the very definition of evil. Evil isn't just doing immoral things. In the biblical context, evil is being self-directed and independent. Evil is seeking what is pleasing in our own eyes, which led to the fall in the garden. Evil is seeking a path forward where God is not consulted, but is ignored instead. And so, what is the protection against this unbelief? The amazing thing about this is that the writer here offers a very practical solution for how do you resist temptation, but most of us are not going to like it. The writer instead tells us to listen to one another. We're told to encourage one another, to protect one another from having hardened hearts. And I'm sure if there was a voice that had boomed overhead and told you what to do, or many of us what to do, all of us would heed its direction. But what would you do if it came from the person that was sitting next to you? What would you do if you had to heed the counsel of someone that spoke to you in a Sunday school class or shared a message from the pulpit? Would you heed it then if it came from a brother or sister that you may not know that well? The question is, are we all teachable? I'm sure if we went back and really studied that passage in the promised land where the children of Israel were there on the edge of the promised land for the first time, and they are debating on whether or not they should enter in based upon the feedback that they got from the 12 spies. If God had just spoken to them from heaven, this booming voice that said, have faith, go ahead and go in, or maybe had moved his cloud or his pillar of fire as a sign in order to substantiate what Joshua and Caleb had said, the children of Israel would have went in. But if they had just done what this writer in Hebrews is saying, listen to their brothers and sisters, listen to those that are encouraging you to move forward in the faith, listen to those that are encouraging you to hold on to your faith. If they had just followed that simple advice, they would have entered into the promised land and they would have avoided the 40 years in the wilderness. How often are we missing out on blessings? How often are we missing out on the things that God has for us in this life because we're unwilling to listen to a brother or sister? You know, one last example, illustration about entering the God's rest, and hopefully this one resonates with you. I have two children, two boys, and I love them dearly. And when they were born, you could say that it was very obvious to me and obvious to everyone else that they had a calling on their lives to be men. All right, to be men. That's in a sense what they were kind of born to do. But just as obvious as that was, it was equally obvious that they weren't ready to walk into that calling. Instead, they needed to enter into my rest. They needed to enter into the completed work that I was providing for them that they didn't have to work for themselves. So they needed to eat food that they didn't go out and work for. They needed to live in a home that was provided for them. They needed to be able to benefit from wisdom that they didn't have to go through the hard experience to get. And if they go through and really take advantage of the rest that I'm providing to them, when the time comes, when the season comes for them to walk into their calling, they're going to be prepared for it. In a similar manner, each and every one of us have to enjoy God's rest. We have to enjoy his presence. We have to enjoy the things that he has provided for us because of his completed work. And the better that we do that, the better that we're able to if the better that we're able to enjoy his rest, the more likely, the more capable we're going to be to walking in the calling that he's called each and every one of us to. And what's key to entering the God's rest is faith. We have to believe, and we have to encourage one another to continue on in our faith, and we have to be willing to listen to one another as we continue on in our faith. Well, that's the end of today's message. I really hope that is something that resonates with you and will stick with you. Again, this passage is Hebrews chapter 3, verses 8 through 19. And the idea here is to enter into his rest. If you have some comments or you have some thoughts, please feel free just to leave some comments there. I'd love to interact with you and talk to you more about this idea. Thank you.